They were born quietly, not in daylight, not in records. In the pre-dawn hours of Alabama's Black Belt, mid-1800s, women whispered prayers through clenched teeth as children entered the world already marked by contradiction. Pale skin, freckles, hair the color of rusted iron or dying fire, eyes too light for the cabins they were born into. These girls did not resemble their mothers, and they never resembled the men who claimed ownership over them. Plantation ledgers recorded them without names, only symbols. Asterisked, circled, sometimes crossed out entirely. Overseers muttered that they were errors. Midwives learned to lower their voices when one arrived. Ministers stopped asking questions after the third baptism. Because in Alabama, between 1820 and 1870, something was repeating. Not once, not twice, but again and again. Slave girls born with red hair and pale skin, appearing across counties that shared no bloodline, no roads, no written connection. Mothers swore ignorance. Fathers were never listed. And when questions were asked too loudly, the girls were removed, sent away, to church-run orphan houses, to sanitary schools, to religious homes where records ended and silence began. Local folklore dismissed it as coincidence. White blood shows sometimes, they said, but the numbers grew. Too many for chance, too consistent for rumor. And beneath the soil of Alabama, beneath churches, beneath sermons, beneath hymns sung with closed eyes, something older was protecting itself. Because these children weren't accidents. They were evidence. Marion County no longer exists on modern maps. It was absorbed, renamed, redrawn after the Civil War. But between 1834 and 1861, it was infamous among those who traveled quietly. Midwives, circuit preachers, freed blacks who passed messages mouth to mouth. Marion had a rule. Any enslaved child born with unnatural features was not to be registered locally. The births were recorded elsewhere, or not at all. County clerks used a separate ink, thin, gray, almost invisible, to note these children. In some cases, pages were torn from ledgers entirely. In others, a child would appear once, then never again. Churches played a role. Baptismal records listed initials only. No parent names. No plantation listed. Just dates. And the same repeating phrase written in the margins. Under special care. The orphanage outside Marion, St. Agnes House, was run by men who never married and women who never spoke of their past. Children arrived at night. Children left without ceremony. By age 7, most were gone. Locals claimed they were adopted north. No trains were logged. No wagons recorded the trips. And strangely, every girl who arrived with red hair had it cut short within days. Heads shaved, covered, hidden, because hair carries memory, and someone was trying to erase it. In 1849, Reverend Elias Crowder delivered a sermon that Alabama history tried to forget. He was no abolitionist. He defended slavery publicly. But something had changed him. That Sunday, he stood shaking behind the pulpit, staring at the congregation as if seeing through them. Witnesses later recalled his voice cracking when he reached Genesis. Instead of reading scripture, he began listing numbers, births, dates, girls' ages. He spoke of children, born under covenant, but claimed by no father. He said Alabama had made room for a sin too old to name. He warned that the church itself had become a hiding place. Then he stopped. Crowder looked toward the back pews, where several prominent landowners sat together, and fell silent. The sermon ended without prayer. That night, Crowder disappeared. His home showed no signs of struggle. His Bible remained open on the desk. But one page had been torn out, Genesis 6. The sons of God saw the daughters of men. Church elders ruled his disappearance a nervous breakdown. His name was removed from records within weeks. But among enslaved families, a phrase spread. The preacher saw the fathers. Testimonies collected decades later, during Reconstruction, contain a chilling detail. Some women claimed they saw the same red-haired girls years apart, unchanged. Not immortal, but untouched by time. One former slave, Esther Bell, testified that she worked at St. Agnes House for 3 years. She described a girl named Lillian, pale, silent, eyes like rainwater. Esther saw Lillian at age 6. Then again, 15 years later, still 6. Same height, same voice, same stare. When Esther asked the matron, she was beaten and dismissed that day. Historians dismissed such claims as trauma-induced memory distortion. But they couldn't explain why multiple testimonies, separated by miles and years, described the same girl, or why orphanage cemeteries contain no graves for red-haired children. Not one. Because you don't bury what you still need. In plantation correspondence recovered in the early 1900s, a pattern appears. Men referenced only by first names. No surnames. No family origins. No records of birth or death. They were called visitors, supervisors, clerical guests. They arrived through church channels, stayed briefly, left donations, and during their visits, pregnancies followed. The children born afterward were always girls, always pale, always marked for removal. These men never appeared in census data, never owned land, never aged in photographs. One image from 1863 shows a group of ministers posing after a revival. In the back row stands a man with light hair and eyes too bright for the exposure. The same man appears in a photo dated 1898. Unchanged. Historians called it coincidence. The church called it blessing. But Alabama's soil remembers differently. And what was hidden among those families, what was passed, protected, and fed, was never meant to be loved. Only continued. St. Agnes' house stood 3 miles beyond the nearest road, surrounded by trees that leaned inward as if listening. Officially, it was a refuge. Unofficially, it was a terminal. The building had an attic no child was ever allowed to enter. Staff claimed it held nothing but winter supplies. But former workers remembered hearing footsteps overhead long after curfew. Slow pacing, deliberate, never hurried. Children were never punished by being sent to the attic. They were rewarded. Those selected were always the same type. Pale-skinned girls, quiet, observant, unusually articulate for their age. They were bathed, dressed in white, and led upstairs while the other children were made to kneel and pray. When the girls returned, if they returned at all, they were different. Not frightened, not injured, empty. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others spoke too much, using words no one had taught them. They began finishing sermons before the minister reached the final verse. They corrected scripture with unsettling confidence. And at night, they stood at the windows of St. Agnes' house, staring into the woods, as if waiting for someone who had promised to return. The attic was sealed in 1871, but not before it was cleared, not emptied, cleansed. In 1912, a historian cataloging church archives in Montgomery discovered a locked leather-bound book misfiled among hymnals. It contained minutes from a regional council spanning 50 years. Public meetings discussed charity, funding, and doctrine. Private minutes, written in a cramped, deliberate hand, revealed something else. They spoke of continuation, of vessels, of keeping the line unbroken. The council acknowledged the births as manifestations, not sins. They described the children as answers rather than consequences. One passage reads, "The fathers must remain unnamed. Identity collapses the structure." Another warns, "Should the mothers realize the pattern, the project ends." Nowhere did the council explain the origin of the fathers, only their necessity. The final entry, dated 1893, closes with a sentence underlined 3 times. "The girls remember more than we do. This is dangerous." The book disappeared before it could be photographed. The archivist died 6 months later of consumption. No autopsy was recorded. By the 1850s, enslaved women across Alabama began sharing dreams. Not symbols, not metaphors. The same dream. A white room, stone floors, no windows. Girls standing in a circle, holding hands, hair long and red, chanting in a language that felt older than English but familiar in the mouth. The dream always ended the same way. A door opening, light flooding in, and a voice saying, "It is almost time." Women who shared the dream never met each other. Some lived days apart, some decades. But after dreaming, many refused to let their daughters be taken. Those daughters vanished anyway. Some women attempted escape. Some harmed themselves rather than comply. Plantation records mark these cases as hysteria or spiritual contamination. The churches increased sermons on obedience. The orphanages expanded, and the dreams continued. Because memory, once awakened, spreads. In 1931, a photographer documenting rural Alabama captured an image that unsettled everyone who saw it. The photo showed 5 women standing in front of a collapsed church. 4 were elderly. 1 was a child. All 5 had identical faces. Same eyes, Same bone structure. Same red hair. The child stood at the center. The women's shadows stretched toward her, but her shadow fell in the opposite direction. The photographer claimed the women asked him to take the photo. Then they walked into the woods behind the church. He never saw them again. The negative was archived, mislabeled, and forgotten until the 1970s. When rediscovered, historians dismissed it as a trick of light. But no one could explain why church records listed the same girl's name being baptized in 5 different decades, always at age 6. By the early 20th century, the system began to fail. Railroads exposed secrecy. Newspapers asked questions. Churches rebranded. Orphanages closed. But the pattern did not stop. It adapted. The girls were no longer taken all at once. They were dispersed, integrated, placed into families that did not know what they were raising. Because the truth was never about control. It was about preservation. The council believed the children carried something ancient, a continuity of consciousness, a memory that could survive generations intact if housed correctly. The fathers were not men in the human sense. They were custodians. And Alabama had been their shelter. But something had gone wrong. The girls were beginning to remember everything. By the 1920s, Alabama began modernizing its archives. Typewriters replaced ink. Carbon copies replaced memory. And for the first time, discrepancies became visible. Clerks noticed something disturbing. Girls with identical names, identical birth dates, identical physical descriptions, filed decades apart. Some records listed the same child as deceased and then baptized years later in another county. Others showed adoptions that led nowhere. No household, no follow-up, no census entry. One clerk wrote a note in the margin of a 1924 registry. Either this child has lived far too long, or someone keeps reusing her. The note was crossed out in red pencil. The file vanished the next day. What frightened the archivists most wasn't the repetition. It was the consistency. Human systems decay. They grow sloppy over time. This one did not. In 1936, a custody dispute in rural Alabama forced one of the girls into public view. Her name was listed as Margaret Hale. She appeared to be 8 years old. Pale skin, light eyes, red hair tied neatly back. The court expected fear. Instead, Margaret spoke calmly, politely correcting the judge when he misstated her birth year. She referred to the courtroom as temporary. She asked the bailiff if the building had replaced an older structure, which records later confirmed. When asked about her parents, she answered, "They are not singular." The transcript ends abruptly. The case was sealed on grounds of mental abnormality. Margaret was remanded to church custody. There are no further records of her. But one observer, a stenographer, later claimed Margaret looked directly at her while being escorted out and said, "You will forget this by choice." The stenographer resigned 3 days later. She never explained why. Between 1938 and 1944, at least 7 rural churches across Alabama suffered unexplained fires. Each fire began below ground. Basements, storage vaults, foundation rooms not listed on blueprints. The official cause was faulty wiring. But witnesses reported something unusual. The fires burned downward, not up. After the fires, church leaders ordered immediate reconstruction, without salvaging records, without investigations. What was lost was never itemized. What survived was never shown. In one case, firefighters reported finding stone floors beneath wooden basements, older than the churches themselves, marked with circular grooves worn smooth by use. By what? No one could say. The churches reopened within months. Their sermons changed. They stopped speaking of obedience. They began speaking of forgetting. Doctors and nurses working in segregated hospitals during the 1940s recorded a pattern they could not explain. Elderly black women, many born into slavery, began speaking the same sentences shortly before death. Different hospitals, different years, same words. They spoke of rooms without windows, of children standing in circles, of men who never aged and never stayed. Most unsettling was what they said last. The girls are waking up. Medical staff dismissed it as shared cultural memory. But one nurse noted that several of the women had never met, never lived near one another, and had been separated by more than 100 miles. Memory was not being passed down. It was being reactivated. The final known church council meeting addressing the phenomenon occurred in 1949. It was not announced publicly. The minutes, recovered from a private estate decades later, are brief, urgent, and fearful. They acknowledged failure. The girls were no longer compliant. They were no longer isolated. Some had integrated fully into society. Others had vanished on their own terms. One line stands out. They do not need us anymore. Another follows. They remember the fathers, and they are not grateful. The council voted unanimously to dissolve the project, not because it was wrong, but because it could no longer be controlled. The final sentence in the minutes reads, "If they choose to return, we will not see them coming." After 1950, the reports stopped abruptly. No more orphanage transfers. No more sealed baptisms. No more whispered warnings between churches. But disappearance did not mean resolution. Across Alabama, women recalled red-haired classmates who simply left. Not ran away. Not taken. They packed their things calmly, thanked their hosts, and walked down roads without looking back. They did not take money. They did not say where they were going. And no one ever reported them missing, because something about their departure discouraged pursuit. Neighbors later said they felt relief rather than concern, as if a tension they never named had finally lifted, as if something had finished using the place. Section 17. The houses that would not keep tenants. In the decades that followed, certain buildings developed reputations. Former orphanages, converted parsonages, rural homes built atop older foundations. Tenants moved in hopeful. They moved out uneasy. People reported the same sensations, the feeling of being watched not from corners, but from within. Not haunted, but remembered. Mirrors felt wrong. Children asked questions adults couldn't answer, about rooms that no longer existed, about women they claimed to know but had never met. And in some homes, red hair appeared where no red hair had existed before. Not births, just appearance. Archivists studying the 1931 photograph, the 5 identical women and the child, noticed something impossible. The image did not remain consistent. The faces were the same, but the background shifted slightly between reproductions. Trees grew fuller. Ruins collapsed further. Light angles changed, but the figures remained untouched by time. One archivist noted a final detail before the image was removed from public access. In later copies, the child was no longer in the center. She was closer. The churches believed they were preserving something, containing it, managing it, but they misunderstood the nature of what they served. The girls were never vessels. They were continuities, living archives of experience, memory, and identity, passed not by blood alone, but by attention, ritual, and secrecy. The fathers were not creators. They were witnesses. And when the witnesses were no longer needed, they were forgotten. Because nothing that remembers itself forever needs permission to continue. Today, Alabama's records appear clean. Churches stand renovated. Orphanages are museums. Ledgers are digitized and indexed. But history is not erased by order, only buried. And buried things do not die. They wait. If this story unsettles you, it should. Because it was never meant to frighten. It was meant to warn. Not about monsters, but about institutions that believe they can control what they do not understand, and the quiet consequences of generations taught not to ask where children come from, or where they go. Some stories end. Others simply stop being told. And the ones that stop being told are the ones most likely to return.